distribution issues are resolved, then a lot of the pressure on prices will also be resolved. Again, talking to what we focus on when we're doing monetary policy, which is the non-food, non-fuel, which we don't have control over. And what we see there is that the monetary policy approach is working because we can see very little pressure on core inflation. We look at the exchange rate and also the current account. I'd like to speak a little bit to the exchange rate. What we look at primarily on the exchange rate, and it's something that we do every day at the central bank, is at the end of the day, we monitor the inflows and outflows. And we've been doing this for about 2 years now. And what we see is generally a balance. And when there isn't a balance, you can clearly see why the balance is not there, and that's usually seasonal factors. For example, now we're entering dividend season, so a possibility that there'll be more outflows than inflows. But at the same time, we've had very good inflows from China Roads, which is starting the next stage of the SGR and things like that. So we're very, very, very aware, and we monitor very closely what is happening on the inflows and outflows within the economy. We found 2 years ago a certain amount of indiscipline within the foreign exchange markets, and through this monitoring, we've reasserted the role of the central bank in disciplining the foreign exchange markets so that they do not influence the direction of the shilling. I think that's the polite way of doing it. I was in South Africa a month ago for a forum that was involving African banking sector. And at that meeting was the central bank governor of South Africa. And this big scandal broke where 17 banks in South Africa for 7 years have been manipulating the currency. 17 banks for 7 years have been manipulating the currency. So what we're doing in the Kenyan market is not controlling the currency. I really don't. Everybody keeps asking me, what's your position? I have no position. If the market has a problem, we'll go one way. If it gets very strong, we'll go the other way. But it has to be fundamental economic forces and not the pressure of influence coming from whatever source. And we are aware of what's happening globally, and we are aware of what happened in South Africa. And so we'll be monitoring closely and making sure that this is not repeated in the Kenyan markets. When we look at the current account, I remember when I first took over, it was around June 2015, June, July, and you can see the current account was there at 9%. I got up and made a speech and said that it would return to around the 5% level. And I remember an economist coming up to me and telling me I'm not an economist and really I've got it wrong. I've still been looking for him. He's hiding from me because we are now at 5.5%. And we knew specifically, again, it didn't take great brains to analyze what it was. We know that we spent a lot on SGR, so that there was a lot of pressure. As we've come out of the SGR, it's now at near completion stage. We've gone to 5. When we started again going back into Naivasha, there was the thing on the aeroplanes. We were buying a lot of aeroplanes. It put pressure on the current account. We're not buying them anymore. In fact, we sold some. So the numbers talk. And as I say, as a central bank, what we try and do is just stick with the data, not get involved in any other issues. So what we've got is improved current account, again, low oil prices. Exports, I said about the tea last year was very strong. SGR and aircrafts, and recovery in tourism. This foreign reserve buffer that we've got here is a bit dated. It's 7.7 billion with 5.1%. So we're at, I think, second highest level ever. I think the highest level of reserves that Kenya's ever had is 7.9. So we're at 7.7 now, so it gives us a lot of protection. And resilient diaspora remittances, what we're finding is no matter what happens, whether there's Brexit, whether there's the American, what do we call it, change in administration, the diaspora remittances remain. Kenyan exports to the region. This is another of our strengths. A lot of economies in Africa are fairly dominant in dollars. And so what happens to the dollar has a lot of influence in the domestic economy. But Kenya actually is a bit different. You can see that 40% is within the region. And then even then, if you add in Pakistan and UAE, you'll find that we're above 50, we're about 54%, which is exports to non-dollar dominated economies. And therefore, we have a balance So if a lot of the rest of our exports are dollar denominated, we're not so, we have some protection in that. When we talk about imports, this number here that we have is slightly distorted, where it shows that China is 25% of our imports, because this is really heavily influenced by SGR. So as we move forward and SGR becomes less of a player, that number will decline. What we used to see in the past was UAE and India being prominent areas where we import from. But it again shows, what's interesting as well is America also, USA, is increasing in its play in Kenya. People talk a lot about debt, and we had some comments made earlier. As I say, I don't like to comment on what commercials think. Commercial sector thinks that's their business. My business is to stick to facts. 77% debt to GDP ratio in the year 2000. We're about 55, 54 now. I always look at Kenya like a young adult. You've come through a certain stage of development, and you've reached a stage now where you have 60% of your population below 30 odd years. And so if you don't invest now, if you don't create opportunities now, then what is going to happen? What is going to happen? And so you have to actually take that brave step forward. And now is the right time, because if we invest now, we can see that we have a youthful population going forward that will be able to repay. We're also, in comparison, well positioned in growth. Our growth is still higher in GDP than in debt. So there's so many reasons to move forward at this point in time. The speed at which you move forward, maybe that's the thing that we should be talking about. And some people may say we should go slower, some people may say we should go faster, but actually the quantum, I think, is not really the problem. And the IMF and the World Bank reports have shown that. I think on the IMF, they gave us clearance in November on the IMF program, and I think they rated us as the least likely to default. So what else do we want to say? You have to take some risk if you want to move forward. So what we're seeing here, what else do I need to pick up here? I think that's it. Yeah, we also achieved a lot in the last 5 years, whereas a lot of other African countries were able to reduce their debt to GDP ratio. They took it through the HIPC program, which of course Kenya was not party to. So our 55% there is really off the back of our own endeavors. It's not off the back of any kind of concessions. This is an area that everybody's talking about, and if any of you have read the monetary policy statement, it's obviously one of the areas of concern that we have. I have a lot of people telling me that the fall in the credit is because of the introduction of the Interest Rate Act. Well, what we can see is the Interest Rate Act came in September, and those numbers tell me that actually it bottomed out at that point. And I believe now we're at 5.5, so it's actually started heading back up again. So the issue is that we should all be very concerned about this, because this will have an implication on our growth, and we need to understand what is creating it. It's quite complicated, and I think Kenya's economy now is becoming quite deep and diverse, so anything that you look at is more complicated than it was in the past. But what we've seen is that there's 4 sectors that have 60% of the credit, and that's trade, manufacturing, real estate, and private households. And we see that as the areas that are driving the fall in credit. When we look at it, what we see is real estate and also affecting private households, because Kenyans are very interesting. We don't actually borrow to consume, we borrow to produce. So a Kenyan borrows money to buy a pickup, buy land, pay for school fees, develop a property. So it's quite different borrowing from the pure consumption borrowing. So even when we see private households there, you better be aware it's going into business, it's going into land, it's going into pickups and things like that. So the real estate area, we've seen quite a lot of issues, challenges that have occurred in the real estate area. Firstly, there was the whole issue around titles for land, and there was delays in the issuance. So that slows down whatever's being created. Then you had the issue of buildings collapsing, and there was further constraints and increases in standards around construction. So those we believe has had an impact. With manufacturing, we've been saying for a while, I think if you look back 6 months, 8 months, you'll see the World Bank came out with a report around Kenyan manufacturing and saying that it really needed to relook at itself and perhaps do what Business Daily has done, which is revive yourself so that you're competitive. There's a lot of competition coming in, and people keep saying Chinese. Yes, Chinese and others. So into our regional markets, we're no longer the dominant player. We're no longer the monopoly. We're no longer the only player. So there are other players in those markets, and we need to compete with them. On the trade side as well, I think what we saw in the previous years a lot of our trade growth being driven by communications and also being driven by our retail sector supermarkets. And we've seen issues in both of those areas. So when you look at all of that together, you start to understand what's happening, and you start to focus on what needs to be done now so that we don't allow this credit decline to go any further, and we start picking it up. Again, people say, what level of credit should we have? I don't know, but I know that we should drive a certain element of growth, and 6% of growth is what we're looking for, so we need credit to support that type of growth projection. Kenya's banking sector, financial sector, really remains very, very attractive. I know that we've had our problems. When I first came to Central Bank 2 years ago, I got a call from someone overseas, and they said, you know, what's happening in Africa? When you look at America and you look at Europe and all the issues with the banks, does that mean that the Kenyan banking sector was completely removed? There was no connection? Or does that mean that, you know, the regulators have not seen? And I really didn't have an answer. I didn't know. But obviously we saw that there were some problems. We've addressed those problems. When we travel around the continent now, Dakar, Lagos, South Africa, everybody is saying that we started something that now has continued. I think in Nigeria they've closed some banks, South Africa, Uganda. So there was the same issues, and they are being addressed. And you know, for Kenya now, we see that there's a period of stability. We see that central bank has allowed 2 licensing of banks that had started before we put the moratorium on banks to continue. This is a sign that, and I think in the paper somewhere today I read it, a sign of a realization that we're heading back to an area of stability and growth. I think SMEs, again, obviously the Interest Rate Act is not helpful to us, but when we look at comparisons and we look at who lends to SMEs, we actually see the Kenyan financial sector is I don't want to say fantastic, because that can't be the case, but it's competing well, let's put it that way. Kenya has the highest percentage of people with mobile accounts. I want to really talk to the mobile story because it's actually come as one of the DNA aspects of being a Kenyan now. I think we have tea, coffee, runners, and we also have mobile money. And you know, it defines us. It defines us. And everywhere I go, they want at least quarter of whatever I say to be about mobile money. So let me talk to it a little bit. We can see now how domineering we are when we look at this graph. I think that central bank, I can say this because I've been at the central bank 2 years, and I found the story there, so I'm not claiming any fame with what I'm saying, but I'm saying the central bank in the past has done a good job. Money transfer services and payment platforms are old hat to Kenyans now. We expect that. It's nothing that we think is fantastic. Obviously, we've moved into promoting savings and investment channels. The government came out just recently with Akiba, which is one of the investment channels. We're also looking at access to essential utilities. This has actually come into play a lot with the recent dry weather conditions. We've seen people who have 3 or 4 cows that have been able to insure them through the mobile money insurance platforms now actually reaping the benefit out of this. So you put these things in place and you wonder, really, are they going to pay? And then suddenly you see they are paying. Obviously, in Laikipia, we have other issues, but I'm talking about the small scale units. Cross-border money remittances is the new thing, and everybody, you know, if you go to South Africa and you talk to Kenyans, this is how they operate. In fact, I think they use more their phone than they do their bank account. Competitively, yes, Kenya is performing reasonably well. You know, I put that comment, but Kenya needs to do more. Because we know when we sit here that we may be performing fairly well against the region, against our peers, etc. But we all know of things that need to be done better. And so I think that's really the statement coming out of here. This is one story that I really love. You know, being a woman, it's very interesting. Even if I look around this room now, the number of women, we're still minority. So you spend all your life in this minority position, and you suddenly find a product that doesn't put you in that class. I think it's the first product that comes out that's 71, 70, 79. 8% difference. On all other products, women are like 30 or 40% behind. That's not to say it's a perfect reflection, because we've still got areas of the country which still are not serviced, and mainly women are affected in those areas of the country. But it really is a game changer to see a very important product that doesn't discriminate so drastically between women and men. However, this is the other problem. If you look at Marsabit, Kakuma, those areas, Mandera, and look, there's no coverage. So the coverage is just in the urban areas of Kenya, and that's where we get our 75%. But the other areas do not have coverage. But last week I had a delightful occasion to speak to someone who's working with Google. And Google has some form of balloon structure, and they're going to test it here in Kenya as the first. And they'll be able to put balloons into the air that will enable the signal to be transmitted. So this is now something, again, a first for Kenya, which will allow us to get into that 25% zone. So we're watching with interest to see how that will pan out. Kenya's mobile money story is firstly the DNA of Kenyans. There was something about mobile phones and mobile money, maybe because we had no landlines, and we also had very poor banking services in the past that drove us in that direction. Secondly, we have a twin distribution channel. In most other countries, you'll find that they either distribute through banks only, or they distribute through telcos only. But Kenya is the only country where you have strong competition between the banks and the telcos. And as we know, the banks started a bit later, and we can see that that's an impact. When you look at the numbers, they're amazing. I mean, 38 million subscribers, 26 who are on mobile money. We have, in fact, this number is old. I think the number of agents now is 160 something, and 90% penetration. So we can see why it's such a successful product. And finally, just to say that, you know, in the financial and digital inclusion space, we're actually the leaders. At least we were in 2015. It's something we must be proud of. With that, I'd like to say thank you.
I think there was no better person to do justice to this occasion than the Deputy Governor herself. Business Daily is about insight, is about knowledge. And I think we are leaving here with a little more than we came with. And now I take this opportunity to just give a vote of thanks, and then we can break. May I take this opportunity to thank sincerely the Deputy Governor, Sheila Mijiwe, who has just been here. I think it was just the day before yesterday when we were trying to reach her for this, to invite her to come to this occasion. And it wasn't until yesterday that we managed to speak with her, and she graciously agreed. And you can see that it's like she prepared for it all along. Thank you very much. I would like to also thank Edwin Dandy of Saiton, whom we also invited to give us some insights into the economy, a task that he undertook very well. Thank you, Edwin, for accepting our invitation. Thank you, distinguished guests who honored our invitation to come and be with us this morning. Thank you to investors and partners, the consumers who interact with Business Daily on digital and print platforms, the Nation Media Group team led by our CEO, Joe Muganda, and we would also like to thank our hosts, the Intercon Hotel. Thank you very much. Let's continue interacting, and good day.